Thank you so much for coming to my presentation. Today we're going to be learning about the French Château, a subject that is definitely recognizable to most people, but I really want to take the time in this presentation to explore the importance of chateaus, not just as beautiful works of architecture, but also as important venues where the history of France was shaped throughout the development of its history. And so today we're going to look at the history of the French chateau through learning about the lives of 5 of the most important women in the history of France. So let's get started. Before we begin our exploration of these 5 incredible women, I want to start by just discussing what is meant by the term chateau. So, what the bleep is a chateau? Doesn't chateau just mean castle? Well, if you take the example of the Château d'Angers, this structure that really is similar to what most of us think of when we think of a French chateau. In French, it's referred to as the Château d'Angers, and in English, it's referred to as the Castle of Angers. So that seems to be a direct translation. But if we look at another famous chateau, the Château de Versailles, in English, it's referred to as the Palace of Versailles. So whereas the word chateau referred to both of these structures, in English, different terms, castle and palace, are used to refer to them. So why is that? And to illustrate the significance of the term chateau and how it doesn't necessarily translate directly into the word castle, I want to go through a couple of quiz examples. So, pop quiz, is this a chateau? Well, if you said yes, you would be incorrect. No, this is actually the fortress of Sales in the Aquitaine region of France. It is an example of a fortress. And the reason it's a fortress as opposed to a chateau is that it served primarily a military function. This was not a residence. A chateau, yes, in the Middle Ages would have some of these fortification elements, but was first and foremost a residence. So that's one of the first important elements of the definition. Okay, part 2, is this a chateau? If you said yes, that would also be incorrect. This is the Conciergerie in Paris, the former Palais de la Cité, and while the kings of France did spend time in this structure, and it from time to time served as a residence, it was primarily served a public function where different elements and functions of government would be held. But another important element that makes it not a chateau is its location. Chateaus are traditionally in rural or suburban settings, whereas this, in the heart of Paris, is not part of an estate. It's right within the city. And so one thing we'll come to see that defines the chateau is its relationship with the princely estate, usually in the countryside. Okay, let's do a couple more. Is this a chateau? Well, if you answered yes, then yes, you would be correct. In fact, this is the Chateau of Bouge, located in the Loire Valley. And while this may not look like the image one has when you think of a chateau with its medieval towers, this is what a chateau would look like in the 18th century. So what's important with this example is that chateau does not refer to a style. It really would be interpreted based on the styles of the time. Rather, the chateau is more of the function of the building based on its definition as an aristocratic residence. And then finally, is this a chateau? Well, yes and no. While the outer ramparts you see around here are not a chateau, this is actually part of a citadel, this structure located inside of the citadel was at one point a chateau, and that it was part of the estate of the Count of Carcassonne. So with these examples in mind, I would like to clarify the way I will be defining a chateau for the presentation. So a chateau is a residence that's part of an estate, usually tied to a princely title. It is rural or suburban, so in other words, it's not located just within the city. It's also generally owned by a member of the nobility or the royal family. And most importantly for this presentation, it is a symbol of social and or political power or status. So yes, they're a residence, but they also are important symbols of the wealth, power, and prestige of the noble family that resides in the residence. So with this definition in mind, just a quick glossary of terms, because we're talking so much about the French aristocracy, I just wanted to show you some of the different terms you'll be hearing, especially roi or reine, which is king or queen, which is the highest rank. Below that is actually the rank of le dauphin, which literally does mean dolphin, but it refers to the coat of arms that are given to the heir to the French crown. Below that, you have princes, and then dukes, and then marquises, and those are the main titles that you'll be hearing today. So let's get started with our first character, Eleanor of Aquitaine. So starting back in the Middle Ages. Eleanor of Aquitaine, as her name suggests, was born in the Duchy of Aquitaine in 1124, right outside of Bordeaux, in the Château de Belin, pictured on your right, and on the left is an image of what Bordeaux would have looked like in the Middle Ages. The Duchy of Aquitaine was pictured in blue in this map of France from the period in the 12th century, was one of a handful of essentially independent principalities that were within modern day France, but were almost entirely independent from the French domain. In fact, if you compare the royal domain in dark green to that of the Duchy of Aquitaine, you'll see that just geographically, Aquitaine was much larger than France itself. Bordeaux, the city where Eleanor was born, was one of the wealthiest cities in all of Europe, mostly because of its vineyards, and they were able to produce wine, which they sold throughout the trade routes of Europe in the time. And Bordeaux to this day is known for its wine, supposedly some of the best in the world. But the cultural capital of the Duchy of Aquitaine was the city of Poitiers. And this is an image of Poitiers as it looks today. It hasn't changed much from the Middle Ages. And this was a very vibrant cultural center known as the birthplace of the troubadour, these poets and musicians who wrote songs about courtly love and chivalry, particularly songs dedicated to princely and noble women of the period. And so it's within this culture of music and poetry and love that Eleanor is born into in the early 12th century. Although we don't really have many visual representations of Eleanor from the time, troubadours of the period spoke about her incredible beauty, and in 19th century representations of her by romantic painters like Frederick Sandys, we can see her depicted as a beautiful woman. So Eleanor, at the age of 13, was not only recognized as one of the most beautiful girls in all of Europe, but because she stood to inherit the Duchy of Aquitaine, she would be one of the wealthiest and most powerful. So that made her the most sought-after woman in all of Europe, and almost every prince was hoping for a chance to marry her. Finally, the prince that did marry her was the future Louis VII, King of France, who married Eleanor in 1137, and he became King of France as King Louis VII later that year. And on the left, you can see a manuscript depicting their marriage. Their marriage started out pretty rocky. Louis VII was extremely conservative, devout, and pious, whereas Eleanor loved music, poetry, and having fun. So their marriage started out pretty rocky, and they did go on a grand adventure together in 1147. Eleanor accompanied the troops of the French king on the crusade, which was this holy quest by Christian rulers to go to modern-day Turkey and the Middle East in order to reconquer biblical cities that by this point were ruled over by Islamic rulers. So they made the voyage from France to Antioch, and Antioch had actually been captured by Christian rulers in the First Crusade and was now actually ruled over by Eleanor's own uncle, Raymond of Poitiers. But things got very difficult there when Raymond of Poitiers, pictured here receiving Louis VII, wanted to get help in defending his city from local invaders. Louis VII refused for a number of reasons, but one rumor circulating at the time was that Eleanor was engaged in an incestuous relationship with her own uncle. Eventually, the crusade was very much a catastrophe, and they returned to Paris in 1152. After returning to Paris, Eleanor was really not getting along very well with Louis VII, and they ultimately had an annulment of their marriage and went their separate ways. But Eleanor wasn't single for too long. For later in 1152, she marries Henry Plantagenet, the heir to the throne of England, pictured here in this manuscript illustration on the right. So Eleanor leaves Paris and ultimately is married to Henry. Upon her marriage to Henry, who becomes Henry II, King of England in 1154, Eleanor then becomes Queen of England, and their marriage forms the largest empire in Europe. For Henry was not only King of England, but he also was Duke of Normandy, Brittany, and also was Duke of Anjou. So combined with the territories inherited by Eleanor in pink here, they formed a very mighty empire. Because of the size of the empire, Eleanor was sent to her native Aquitaine and established a court in Poitiers where she could rule that region of France on behalf of her husband. And while in Poitiers, she commissioned the construction of the truly spectacular Great Hall, pictured on the left with these delicate Gothic arches, inside of the Chateau of the Dukes of Aquitaine in Poitiers, and on the right is an illustration of how the chateau would have appeared in the time of Eleanor. This was also the period of the Château Fort. The Château Fort, French for fortified chateau or fortified castle. This is the type of chateau that one thinks of when they think of a medieval castle, with these large stone towers that did in fact serve a defensive purpose, but were primarily residences. One of the Château Fort built by the family of Henry II was the Château de Falaise, built by his great-grandfather William the Conqueror, the first Norman who conquered England. The Château de Falaise, again pictured on the left, was an example of the medieval stone keep Château Fort, with a large stone keep in the center surrounded by stone walls, as you can see from the ruins of the chateau on the left. Other Château Forts built by Eleanor's family include the Château de Gaillard, built by Eleanor's favorite son, Richard the Lionheart, pictured in a 19th century sculpture on the left. And what we can see here are the extraordinary ruins of the Château de Gaillard in Normandy. And in the bottom right, you can see a digital recreation of what this extraordinary Château Fort would have looked like. But things by 1173 were getting ugly. Eleanor, with the help of her sons based in France, staged a rebellion in order to seize the French-held territories from Henry II. Later historians claimed that Eleanor's desire to rebel against her husband stemmed from her great jealousy at the fact that Henry II was involved with a mistress, Mistress Rosamond Clifford, and here's a 19th century painting showing Eleanor attempting to poison Rosamond. Modern historians, however, refute that theory, discrediting it as really an attempt to show Eleanor's political actions as the result of her feminine emotions, where in actuality, it was an example of her true political calculus. That being said, things turned out really badly for Eleanor, and Henry II's armies ultimately defeated her, and Eleanor was taken prisoner in 1173. And she was taken to the Chateau of Chinon, a beautiful chateau near the Loire Valley that was built by Henry II in the 12th century. While this medieval chateau looks very romantic to us today, Eleanor's view from this prison tower would have been anything but, and she would stay locked away in this prison for several months before ultimately being taken back to England, where she was imprisoned for 15 years. Until 1189, when Eleanor's husband, Henry II, died, and you can see him on the right in his tomb effigy sculpture at the site of his burial in Fontevraud in the Duchy of Anjou. After Henry II's death, he is succeeded by Eleanor's favorite son, Richard the Lionheart, who not only immediately frees her from prison, but also establishes her as Queen Regent while Richard goes on the Third Crusade. But tragedy strikes Eleanor yet again. Upon Richard the Lionheart's return from Crusade in 1199, he stops to attack the chateau owned by a rival nobleman, where he is hit with an arrow, which ultimately leads to his death in 1199 at the Chateau de Chalus-Chabrol. Absolutely heartbroken, Eleanor retires from public life and goes to the Abbey of Fontevraud, where Henry II had been buried. She expands the abbey, and she ultimately dies there in 1204. On the right is the recumbent tomb effigy sculpted depicting Eleanor at the site of her burial, and this is commonly believed to be the most accurate depiction of what she looked like, but clearly idealizing her, for at the time of her death, she was 82 years old. She can be seen in her recumbent effigy next to the husband, Henry II, with whom she fought so much. And together in the Fontevraud Abbey, you can also see the sculpture depicting her favorite son, Richard the Lionheart. And while they're all there together, only Eleanor is depicted reading a book, the Bible, really depicting her as a woman of the arts and of literature, and someone who would have a profound influence on the history of both France and England, two countries that would go to war in our next chapter. Chapter 2, Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc, a figure from history that I'm sure almost all of you are familiar with. She was born in 1412 in Domremy, France. She was born in this home, seen on the left, and while she's commonly believed to have been a very poor peasant girl, the fact is that her father, although not a nobleman, was a landowner. He owned a farm, which made him very well off, at least by the standards of the time. And you can see on the right an illustration of Joan of Arc, which is one of the only drawings of her from the time where she was alive. In order to understand the importance of Joan of Arc, who likely would have grown up an anonymous person that we wouldn't be talking about today if it wasn't for her involvement in one of the most tragic but also important events in French history, the 100 Years' War. So on this map on the left, this shows France as we saw it during the time of Eleanor of Aquitaine in the 12th century. All of this territory in pink and in red was part of the Kingdom of England. But fast forward 2 centuries, the successive French kings were able to acquire almost all of modern day France for themselves. And so by the reign of the French King Charles IV in the 14th century, everything we see here in blue and purple belonged to the French, and the only English stronghold remaining in France is this pink area here known as Gascony. But Charles IV dies in 1328. Which led to a crisis for succession as he had no male heirs. Who would succeed him? One candidate was the English King Edward III, who was the sororal nephew of Charles IV, meaning he was the son of Charles IV's sister, Isabella. On the other side, claiming the throne, was Philippe of Valois, the paternal cousin of Charles IV. He was the son of Charles IV's uncle. Ultimately, however, the crown went to Philippe of Valois because he had descended through the uncle of Charles IV, a male ancestor, whereas Edward III had descended from Charles IV's sister, a female ancestor, which forbade him for taking the throne based on French Salic law. So the crown ultimately goes to Philippe of Valois, who is crowned as King Philip VI in 1328. At this period, when Philip VI is crowned King of France, Edward, as King of England, only holds the territory of Gascony, but that makes Philip VI very nervous because he does have some claims to the throne, so he demands Edward III to pay fealty to him as his vassal. Edward III refuses, and so Philip VI confiscates Gascony from the English, which enrages Edward III, which starts a war that would last not 100, but 116 years, and it was a war between the French and the English over who would control all of France. By the time of Joan of Arc's birth in 1412, things had gone very badly for the French. This map on the left shows what France looked like at the start of the war, where almost all of modern-day France was held by the French monarchs. But by the first part of the 15th century, the English had taken over almost all of northern France, everything in pink, including Paris, which was in the hands of the English. And in 1422, the English king Henry VI would crown himself as Henry II, King of France, while the true heir to the French throne, le Dauphin, meaning the supposed heir to the throne, had to remain in exile in southern France. The site of Joan of Arc's birth in Domremy had been taken over by the English, and she writes about how the English had burned her village, which made her despise them and want to kick them out of France forever. She had a little help with her dream of helping the French to take over the rest of the country when she was visited, according to her, by a number of saints, including St. Catherine, St. Margaret, and the Archangel Michael. She tells these visions to the local garrison officer at the Château de Vaucouleurs and asked for an escort to be taken to see the true king, the Dauphin Charles of Valois, in order to say and offer her help in defeating the English. So she's taken to see the true French king at the Château de Chinon, the same chateau that you may remember is where Eleanor of Aquitaine had been held a couple centuries earlier. She is granted an audience with the true French king, and he ultimately agrees to have her lead his armies into battle to reconquer France. And this starts off very well, starting in 1429. Joan of Arc leads the French king's armies to Orléans, which was held by the English, which they successfully siege in 1429. And in the bottom right is a illustration of what Orléans, the walled city of Orléans, looked like at the time. So no small feat, but she is successful. Charles, the future French king, and his troops are really starting to believe that God really may be on their side. And as a means of thanking Joan of Arc, he invites her to stay with him at his extraordinary Château de Loches in the Loire Valley. And we can see by this time that chateaus are starting to become much more decorative and much less militaristic in their design, with these beautifully decorated dormer windows. The true goal of Joan of Arc is to get Charles to the French city of Reims, the site of the Cathedral of Reims, which is where all French kings had been crowned since the 9th century. This was the only way to legitimize his claim as the true French king. They're successful in their voyage to Reims, and Charles, le Dauphin, is crowned as the French King Charles VII at Reims in July 17th, 1429. After this, feeling that God really is on their side, they attempt the impossible. Joan of Arc leads the French troops to seize Paris from the English. And on the left is a beautiful illumination showing how Paris would have looked like in the 15th century. But the siege is not successful, and Joan of Arc is hit with an arrow. While she does not die, this shows not just the troops, but also the king that she is not invincible, which demoralizes them, and they start to believe that maybe she does not have God on her side. So Joan of Arc is taken to the spectacular Chateau of Sully-sur-Loire, pictured here in the Loire Valley, where she's not held prisoner, but she's hosted there, and one of the courtiers of Charles VII, Georges de la Trémoille, is tasked with keeping her there while the king can attempt to make a peace agreement with the English. And here's another beautiful image of the Chateau of Sully-sur-Loire. When Joan of Arc hears that the king is wanting to make peace with the English, she escapes the chateau and marches her way to Compiègne in northern France, not far from Paris, to attempt to attack the English again. But on her way north, she is captured by the Burgundians. The Burgundians were French partisans of the English, and she's taken as a prisoner to the Chateau of Beaurevoir, and the image on your right is the last remaining tower from the chateau. She escapes that chateau, but then she's recaptured and then taken to the Chateau of Courtois, where she is eventually held and then ransomed to the English and sent to the English-held city of Rouen. At the Chateau of Rouen, pictured on the left, she is held captive in this cage prison, not unlike the one depicted on the right. She's held there starting in 1430, and there she is interrogated, she's tortured, and ultimately condemned and convicted of committing heresy, and at which point she is burned at the stake on May 30th, 1431, ending the incredible voyage and journey of Joan of Arc. But while Joan of Arc did not survive, ultimately her ambition and all the effort she made were successful after her death. Charles VII would ultimately succeed in recapturing all of France from the English, and by 1453, France appeared as it does here, all in orange, so occupied by the French, earning Charles the name of Charles the Victorious. This period of the 100 Years' War, with new military technology, especially cannons and ultimately gunpowder, would lead to the end of the Château Fort, as it was very, very vulnerable to the new weapons at the time. And so many of these chateaux would be dismantled. As you can see, the Château Rouen was dismantled by the 16th century, but you can still see remnants of it today, including this tower, the Tower of Joan of Arc, where she was held, the last surviving remnant of her legacy in Rouen. Joan of Arc's bravery and the success and unification of France paves the way for this next chapter of the French Renaissance with the character of Diane de Poitiers. Diane de Poitiers was born in Drôme in southeastern France, and she was born in 1500. She married Louis de Brezé in 1515, and Louis de Brezé was a man of a lot of political influence, as he was actually the illegitimate grandson of Joan of Arc's companion, Charles VII. Because of these aristocratic connections, Diane de Poitiers gets a position at the court of the French king François Ier around 1520, where she basically becomes the babysitter of the king's young son, the young Henri, pictured here on the right. In 1531, Diane de Poitiers' husband dies, and she really dedicates all of her time to the court of François Ier, and you can see here on the right, dressed in the colors of mourning. In this period in French history, after 116 years of war and the 100 Years' War, a lot of these medieval chateaux forts had been destroyed. But France, being unified, was not just stopping there. They actually were attempting to expand their territory into Italy. So French kings, starting in the late 16th century, including François Ier, waged military campaigns into Italy, which at this time was not a unified country, but was a patchwork of independent city-states and principalities. While these Italian campaigns were not particularly successful, it did allow a lot of amazing influences to be brought back to France. Of those, one was new forms of military defense. The Chateau Fort, the residence as a form of military fortification, was no longer very useful. And in Italy, they brought back ideas of these purpose-built fortifications, such as this in the Kingdom of Naples on your left, which influenced new purpose-built fortifications built by François Ier, such as those he built for the French city of La Rochelle, pictured on the right. But other things brought back from Italy were the arts. When he was in Italy, François Ier met the Italian Renaissance painter Leonardo da Vinci and actually invited him back to his court, which Leonardo did in 1516, bringing with him a number of paintings, including one you might have heard of, the Mona Lisa, which is why that painting still hangs in the Louvre to this day. In this period, the French kings, starting with François Ier, were building a number of chateaux in the Loire Valley, not as places for defense, but as places for courtly life. They didn't just live in one chateau, but had an itinerant court, as you can see pictured in the bottom right, where François Ier and his retinue of courtiers would travel from chateau to chateau, and the Loire Valley was really the French Valley of Kings in the beginning of the 16th century. One of the most magnificent of these chateaux was the Chateau of Chambord that was built between 1519 and 1547 for François Ier. This chateau, although it does have some remnants of these large circular towers like they did in the Middle Ages, incorporates a lot of new Italian artistic influences, such as, for example, these cupola that were inspired by the charter house of Pavia in northern Italy that we know François Ier would have seen during his military campaigns. In addition, the interior of the Château de Chambord shows a really spectacular double helix staircase pictured on the left, which many scholars believe was designed, at least in part, by Leonardo da Vinci. And we believe this from some of the drawings that Da Vinci did while he was in France, showing these really fantastical type of intertwining staircases like the illustration on the right. Leonardo da Vinci was not the only Italian artist brought back to the court of François Ier. Some of the most prolific Italian artists to go to France included Francesco Primaticcio, who helped in the renovation of the French Château of Fontainebleau, the exterior court of which, seen on the left and on the right, was the extraordinary bedroom that was decorated with elaborate, sensuous stucco moldings and fresco paintings. That was the bedroom for François I's mistress, Anne Pisseleu, Duchesse d'Étampes, seen on the top right. This was known as the Court of the Ladies, la Cour des Dames, which initially was ruled over by François I's mistress, the Duchesse d'Étampes, but other female figures would have major influence over French culture in the period. François I's son that we saw as a child at the beginning of this section had grown up by the 1530s and was the Dauphin, Prince Henri, and in 1533 he married an Italian princess, Catherine de' Medici, who was a member of the Medici court of Florence. But while Catherine had some initial influence, eventually Henri realized that his former babysitter, Diane de Poitiers, was smoking hot. And he fell in love with his former babysitter, seen here in a portrait. And she became, Diane de Poitiers became Henri's official mistress starting in 1534. Because of her name Diane, which was similar to Diana, the Roman goddess of the hunt and the moon, she often depicted herself or was depicted in the guise of this Roman goddess. As you can see in this ancient Roman sculpture of Diana, the huntress, but also goddess of the moon, of this crescent moon iconography that we can see repeated here. And Prince Henri loved this so much that he actually purchased from the Pope a newly found Roman statue depicting Diana the Huntress, and you can still see this antique sculpture in the Louvre today. There was a big rivalry between Diane de Poitiers and the mistress of François Ier, the current king, and Diane de Poitiers was almost banished by François I's mistress, but things really turned around when François Ier dies in 1547, and Diane de Poitiers' lover, Prince Henri, ascends to the French throne as King Henry II, and then Diane de Poitiers, now in power, is able to exile Duchesse d'Étampes, her rival. A lot of work is done for Diane de Poitiers, starting in the Château of Fontainebleau, where Henri builds this lavish ballroom with frescoes and these beautiful wooden ceiling coffers, which if you look at closely show the coat of arms not just of Henri with this H, but also of Diane de Poitiers with her crescent moon. So this is an official royal chateau, but instead of seeing the coat of arms of the king and the queen, we see the coat of arms of the king and his mistress, the plus que reine, the more than queen. A number of chateaux were built for Diane de Poitiers, including the Château of Annay in the Loire Valley, pictured on the left from what it looked like in the period, built in the 1540s. On the right is the way the chateau appears today. Many parts of it were demolished during the French Revolution. One of the most extraordinary details of the Château d'Annay is the entrance gate, which has a bronze relief showing Diane as the goddess of the hunt, Diana, in this very sensuous sculpture, recalling some of the nude sculpture that was becoming more prominent in Renaissance Italy. And one of the masterpieces at the Château d'Annay was the chapel built by Philibert de Lorme, regarded as the first Renaissance architect born in France, with these extraordinary geometrical designs done in stone. there was a big rivalry between Diane de Poitiers and the Queen, Catherine de' Medici, but the rivalry was very one-sided at first. Diane de Poitiers, with her beauty, was really the more influential vis-a-vis Henry II. Catherine de' Medici, not only was she not regarded as beautiful as Diane de Poitiers, but she was also foreign. She had come from Italy, and this made her not as popular or as influential initially as Diane de Poitiers. One example of this is while the Château de Chaumont, see on the left, to us looks like a beautiful example of chateau architecture, by this point in the Renaissance, it was seen to be old-fashioned. And so this was the chateau, the Gothic chateau that was given to Catherine de' Medici. To see the architectural evolution taking place in the French Renaissance, if you look at the Château de Chaumont given to Catherine de' Medici on the left, compared to the Château d'Ancy-le-Franc, which was another chateau built for Diane de Poitiers, you can see how while they both maintain a certain level of symmetry, these large towers in the medieval structure that really recall these chateau fort fortifications, in the Château d'Ancy-le-Franc, they're sort of softened and turned into more fun pavilions in the Renaissance style. But unfortunately, and this was often the case for mistresses, they were only as powerful for as long as the king was alive. And in 1559, during a jousting tournament, Henry II was wounded and ultimately died, signaling the end of Diane de Poitiers' reign as the more than Queen of France. After Henry II's death, Catherine de' Medici exacts her revenge, banishing Diane de Poitiers, but also confiscating her favorite chateaux, including the most beautiful chateau built for Diane de Poitiers, the famous Château de Chenonceau, with its bridge and gallery that cross over the Loire, and this was taken by Catherine de' Medici. Diane de Poitiers would ultimately die in 1566, and Catherine de' Medici would continue to be extremely powerful and influential on the politics of France, but also much of Europe. And here's some other details of the Château de Chenonceau that Catherine would confiscate. But while the two women did not like each other and were rivals, they today coexist forever in their portraits, which hang next to each other in the Château de Chenonceau, where visitors can go and see these two incredible women in this rivalry and how one was extended very quickly but burned out, whereas the other, Catherine de' Medici, who played the long game, ultimately had the last laugh. And this takes us to the 17th century with another mistress, the Marquise de Montespan. The Marquise de Montespan, born Françoise Athénaïs de Rochechouart before she earned the title of Montespan, was born into a very wealthy noble family at the Château de Lussac, and on the left is all that remains of this once grand chateau. She, as a young noble woman, was supposed to be married to a prince, and she fell in love with a prince, her own Prince Charming, Louis II, Duc de la Trémoille, but he was involved in a duel. He survived the duel, but because dueling was illegal in France, he was forced to flee to Spain, which left the first love of Françoise, the future Marquise de Montespan, was dead, and so she needed to find someone else, which her parents found for her with this handsome man. And she married him, Louis-Henri de Gondrin, Marquis de Montespan, and they were married in 1663, and that's what gave her the title of the Marquise de Montespan. The couple, after their marriage in 1663, moved to Paris, not too far from the Louvre, pictured on the left from a painting from the period, which was the court of the French king at the time, King Louis XIV, who at this period was still a young king in his 20s. This period of the 17th century was dominated by the reign of Louis XIV, who reigned from 1643 until 1715, and this period became known as le grand siècle, or the grand, or the great century, because of the great artistic, cultural, but also political influence of France in this period. And seen here are some depictions of Louis XIV. On the left is showing him as a ballet dancer. He was known as an excellent dancer, but also him dressed as the sun, as he would be known as the Sun King. On the top right is a portrait bust that was done of Louis XIV by the greatest artist of the age, the Italian Baroque sculptor Gian Lorenzo Bernini. And on the bottom shows Louis XIV leading his troops into battle. He was a very successful warrior, earning him the name of Louis le Grand, Louis the Great, after one of his ancient heroes, Alexander the Great. Marquise de Montespan soon became lady-in-waiting to the French queen, Maria Theresa of Spain, seen on the right in a beautiful portrait by Diego Velázquez. She was a Spanish princess, Infanta, who married Louis XIV in 1660, and the Marquise de Montespan became her lady-in-waiting. Being a lady-in-waiting was not like being a maid. It was an exclusive title reserved only for high members of the nobility, and they were really there to accompany the queen and to be part of her entourage. And that was the role that the Marquise de Montespan fell into in the 1660s. At this period, the French court of Louis XIV was divided between two chateaux. The one of the Louvre, which was the city residence, so it was truly a palais, not a chateau, and then the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye, pictured on the left, which was the official country residence of the French court. But while those two structures were the official sites of the court, there was a small hunting lodge built by Louis XIV's father in 1633 that Louis XIV liked to visit in order to take some time away from the court, but he also loved this small hunting lodge as a place to bring his mistresses, including his first main mistress, pictured on the left, Louise de la Vallière. The small hunting lodge, known as Versailles, pictured as it appeared when it was built in 1633, was, soon as it became more of a favorite residence of Louis XIV, was expanded and enlarged. And so by 1668, it appeared as it is depicted on the right, where he still kept it as a big brick structure, but began to expand it and add additional wings to the chateau. As this chateau became a site where he kept bringing more and more people, he eventually decided he wanted to turn it into a larger chateau to house his court. And so by the 1670s, he had expanded the chateau even further. Instead of demolishing it because it held sentimental value, he instead built a large stone sort of a facade to surround the existing brick structure in the Italian style, known as the envelope, as it literally enveloped the older chateau. And seen on the right is an image of Versailles as it appeared with its terrace gardens, which were influenced by the terrace gardens one could have seen in Rome, places like the Palazzo Colonna, seen on the left. Louise de la Vallière, was being the mistress, the main mistress of Louis XIV, started to take a back seat to the Marquise de Montespan, who, being the lady-in-waiting to the queen, was frequently around the French king, and he noticed her, and eventually she would become the favorite mistress of Louis XIV, and Louise de la Vallière was eventually sent to a convent. So when in building out the interiors of the Château de Versailles, Louis XIV had two distinct apartments. On the left, encircled in blue, were the Queen's apartments. In yellow were the King's apartments, but a special set of apartments were made just for the Marquise de Montespan, his official mistress. And those apartments were right within the King's apartment, so Louis XIV could visit her whenever he wanted. And you can see on the right the interior of Louis XIV's bedroom at Versailles. A number of beautiful chateaux were built for the Marquise de Montespan, starting with the Trianon de Porcelaine, the porcelain palace, as you can see depicted here. While the chateau no longer survives, you can see from this illustration that it was encrusted with beautiful pieces of porcelain, including one of the few surviving pieces pictured on the left. Another much larger chateau that was built for the Marquise de Montespan was the Château de Clagny, starting in the 1670s. The chateau does not exist either anymore, but you can see these engravings just how extravagant the chateau was. On the bottom left is a digital reconstruction of the gardens and the Château de Clagny based on how it would have appeared And you can see by comparing it to Versailles, as Versailles was expanded, that it served to influence the final form of Versailles, which was finished by the same architect who did Clagny, Jules Lartois-Monsard. The interiors of Clagny were no less magnificent. On the left is a painting showing the Grande Galerie, the Great Gallery, inside of Clagny, with a portrait of Madame de Montespan. And this gallery was filled with incredible works of art from all around the world, made by some of the greatest artists and artisans in France, including a surviving piece, this incredible cabinet on the right with hard stones, jewels, gold, which today is in the collection of the Dukes of Northumberland in England. The cost of the collections and the chateau were exorbitant. Over the 10-year period where she lived at Clagny, $48 million were spent alone by the king on financing this incredible chateau building project. All of this exuberance ended up causing some scandal. On the left was an image, is a photograph of a painting that depicted Louis XIV as a sort of monstrous satyr sitting next to the Marquise de Montespan, shown as a drunken harlot. And not to forget about the husband, who's still the husband of the Marquise de Montespan, le Marquis de Montespan, who was absolutely enraged by his wife's infidelity, to the point where sources at the time say that he would go to different brothels in the hopes of catching a venereal disease that he could pass to his wife, who would then pass it on to the king as a form of revenge. The Marquise de Montespan had a number of illegitimate children with Louis XIV, 6 in all, some of whom were pictured in this painting on the left, because they wanted to keep the kids a secret, and because the Marquise de Montespan frankly didn't want to spend a whole lot of time with them. They were entrusted to the care of a local woman, Françoise d'Aubigny, pictured on the right, who would take care of these children. By the late 1670s and 1680s, Louis XIV was becoming older and increasingly more religious, and he really started to enjoy the company of Françoise d'Aubigny, who was taking care of the children, because she was very religious as well, and he loved how well she was taking care of these children. And eventually Louis XIV started to fall in love with the caretaker of the illegitimate children and gave her a noble title, giving her the title of the Marquise de Maintenon. Things started becoming really bad for the original mistress, the Marquise de Montespan, when a man was found dead and he had been poisoned by his daughter, the Marquise de Brinvilliers. It turned out that she had acquired the poisons from a local sorceress, a devil worshiper who also sold poisons, named Catherine Lavoisin, pictured on the left. Through the interrogation and torture of the sorceress, she revealed that she had sold poison to none other than the Marquise de Montespan, and that not only that, but that she had seen the Marquise de Montespan participating in black masses where she would lie nude while satanic priests would sacrifice babies on top of her nude body. While this was probably not true, the scandal really caused a lot of problems for Louis XIV, and he ultimately would banish his former mistress, especially after one of Louis XIV's other mistresses, Madame de Fontanges, pictured on the left, was found to have died in suspicious circumstances, and she might have been poisoned by potentially his jealous mistress, Marquise de Montespan. So she is banished, she is sent to a convent, and eventually she purchases the Château d'Oiron on the right, where she will die in 1707, disgraced. The former caretaker of her children, Madame de Maintenon, ultimately marries Louis XIV in a secret marriage after Queen Maria Theresa dies in 1683. So it is the devout former caretaker who truly wins the day. She has Louis XIV demolish the porcelain chateau built for Montespan and replaces it with a marble chateau, the Trianon of marble, that would be a home for the children that were still being taken care of by Madame de Maintenon. And the source of the greatest masterpiece at the Château de Versailles, the Hall of Mirrors, was commissioned in the late 1670s, and to make room for it, the last traces of the Marquise de Montespan at Versailles, her former apartments, were demolished to make way for this beautiful masterpiece, erasing the last trace of the great mistress from the Château de Versailles. And we're going to end today's presentation talking about a figure that I'm sure is very familiar to all of you, Marie Antoinette. But I hope in discussing her, I hope to sort of dispel some myths about her and to show that she wasn't this extremely privileged, heartless queen who deserved her ultimate fate. Yes, she of course had extreme privilege, but I hope to show by exploring her life that she really was a much more incredible person than many modern historians give her credit. So Marie Antoinette was born in 1755 in Vienna at the Hofburg Palace. And she was born as the daughter of the Austrian Empress, Maria Theresa. She was the second to last child and the youngest daughter of the Austrian imperial family. And you can see her pictured here when she was less than 1 year old in this family portrait. Historically, the family of Marie Antoinette, the Austrian Habsburgs, were the historical enemies of the French kings, and they were often at war and at each other's throats. But things changed in the 18th century during the First Treaty of Versailles, when France and Austria signed an alliance. Louis XV formed an alliance, the King of France, with the Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, so that they could band together to fight against a common enemy, the emerging power of Prussia. And as part of this military alliance, there was also a marital alliance where there was an agreement that the heir to the throne of France would marry one of the daughters of the Austrian Empress. So that heir to the Kingdom of France was Louis Auguste, pictured on the right, the future Louis XVI, and he was supposed to marry Maria Carolina, who was the older sister of Marie Antoinette, but when another sister who was supposed to marry the King of Naples died, Maria Carolina took her place and became Queen of Naples, leaving the task of marrying Louis Auguste, the future Louis XVI, to the young Marie Antoinette. So in the year 1770, Marie Antoinette, just 14 years old, made the long voyage from Vienna to Versailles, her future home, pictured on the left. And Versailles, by this point, had been the official court of the kings of France since 1682. When she arrived at Versailles in 1770, she was not yet Queen of France. The king was still Louis XV, and the true ruler at this period was Louis XV's mistress, Madame du Barry, pictured on the right. And for Marie Antoinette, who was 14 years old and who grew up at the court in Vienna, which was much more conservative than the court of France, she thought the idea of a mistress giving orders was absolutely appalling, and the two women absolutely despised each other. But in 1774, Louis XV dies, and Marie Antoinette becomes queen, and her husband, Louis, becomes King Louis XVI, and they kick Madame du Barry out of Versailles. She's exiled to her beautiful Château de Louveciennes, which we can see as one of the earliest examples of the neoclassical style, looking back to the architectural styles of the ancient Greeks and Romans that had been built for her by Louis XV, and she would retire there. So Marie Antoinette, as now Queen of France, had a lot of expectations. At this period, being a royal woman, really her main role vis-a-vis society was to produce an heir. And when she was not getting pregnant, there was a lot of scandal, and her own mother sent her brother to come all the way to Versailles in order to talk to the royal couple about why they're not having children. On the right shows the royal bedroom that had been furnished just for the arrival of Marie Antoinette, but this bedroom became in many ways like a prison to the young queen, who was only about 18 years old at the time, where everyone's watching her trying to have a child, watching her trying to be a queen, making fun of her accent, being that she was Austrian. And really what she wanted to do was not to be in the public eye. What she wanted was to have small groups of friends with whom she could chat, play games, and play music. She loved to play the harp, and you can see on the left is a painting of her in the bedroom. You can see this is the same room as this room here that survives, playing music in front of a small group of friends. So while, because of her high birth, she hated the idea of a mistress, in fact, the true life that she wanted for herself was really much more that in terms of the freedoms that mistresses in this period would have had. And for that reason, she does share a spiritual connection with one of her predecessors, Madame de Pompadour, who was the first main mistress of Louis XV. And she's pictured on the left. And on the left is a portrait of Madame de Pompadour that was very well received. On the right is a portrait of Marie Antoinette that caused scandal because of what she was wearing. She didn't have the freedom to dress the way she wanted or behave the way she wanted, the freedom that a mistress would have had. Madame de Pompadour, as the mistress of Louis XV in the mid-18th century, had a number of beautiful chateaux built for her, some of which still stand, including the Château of Champs-sur-Marne on the upper left. All these chateaux after the death of Madame de Pompadour were dispersed to different members of the court, but one of the chateaux built for Madame de Pompadour, the Petit Trianon, was given to Marie Antoinette in 1774 as a present, and both the Château of the Petit Trianon seen on the left and the large park where it was situated became the true oasis of the Queen Marie Antoinette. She really engaged in these forms of escapism where she could sort of pretend to be someone besides the person she was, besides someone who had all of these expectations to be the perfect queen, to give a son to the crown of France, and where she didn't have to live up to all these expectations and feel like she was disappointing everyone. So she created these landscapes and these romantic scenes within her own garden, like the one on the left with this Temple of Love that she commissioned at Trianon, which was similar to these sort of romantic scenes painted by her favorite artist, Hubert Robert. So you can see on the right with these romantic ruins and another Temple of Love, which inspired the one that she had commissioned in 1777. I believe that her gardens really illustrate her desire for freedom. And on the left, you can see the garden that she built for herself at Trianon with these sort of rustic, idyllic grass, this man-made rock grotto, this small pavilion called the Belvedere, and compare that more naturalistic, romantic landscape to the very severe, formal types of gardens that she would have known at Versailles, built by the very rigid Louis XIV. This fantasy of escapism and of trying to play different roles is really epitomized in the Hamlet. She built a Hamlet, a Norman-style country house at her domain outside of Versailles, where she would pretend to be a peasant. And this really exemplifies the type of escapism that she tried to embrace. Of course, people at the time found it really insulting, for true peasants really did not have the type of luxuries that Marie Antoinette did, no less the type of beautiful interiors that were actually found inside of the Queen's Hamlet. She would participate in these sort of escapist fantasies with her small circle of friends that included the Princesse de Lamballe, pictured on the left, and the Duchesse de Polignac, pictured on the right. And these were women and portraits painted by her favorite portrait painter, Vigée Lebrun, in the self-portrait. And Vigée Lebrun was one of the first women to enter the French Royal Academy of Painting. In 1783, Louis XVI purchased a chateau that had once belonged to the Princesse de Lamballe, the Château de Rambouillet, and he purchased it because he wanted the lands for his hunting. When Marie Antoinette saw the chateau, she called it une gothique crapaudière, a Gothic toad house. She hated it so much. That is, she hated it until she discovered this extraordinary cottage that really embodied the type of art and architecture that she loved, that allowed her to escape her reality. While it looks like not much, a small cottage in the middle of an island on the domain of Rambouillet, just enter inside and you're greeted with an extraordinary salon decorated entirely with tiny pebbles and different seashells from around the world throughout the French Maritime Empire. And here are some extraordinary details where you can see this amazing shell architecture. At the Chateau of Rambouillet, she built a dairy, and a dairy was literally a place where Marie Antoinette would chill milk and make cheeses and drink milk, and again, engaging in this fantasy of trying to be someone else, like a farmer. And you can see in this dairy this incredible grotto with an antique statue, and this allowed Marie Antoinette again to escape the rigors of Versailles at her Chateau of Rambouillet. And to make this fantasy even more complete, she commissioned a full Sèvres porcelain service where she could use to drink milk. And the most famous piece of which was this bowl called the bol sein, literally the breast bowl, that some of her critics said was actually modeled after Marie Antoinette's own breast. Marie Antoinette was the subject of a lot of ridicule, especially for her hairstyles and as you can see on the right in the print called the Triumph of Coquetry, the Triumph of Coquettishness, it shows these women like Marie Antoinette sort of sinking on these boats because their hairstyles are so outlandish, perhaps recalling the actual hairstyle developed by Marie Antoinette seen on the left of an actual big ship, a warship like those used by France in the American War of Independence that were actually formed in her hair. But some of these libels became much more sinister and even pornographic that were circulating at the time leading up to the revolution. Many of these prints also accompanied these very vulgar operas, libretti, including many that showed, like the one on the left, Marie Antoinette having a sexual relationship with the king's brother, and others showing her having a lesbian relationship with her friends, the Duchesse de Polignac and Princesse de Lamballe. A lot of this was stemmed by the fact that people felt that she was secretive because she didn't like to spend a lot of time in public. She wanted to be in private with her friends. But Marie Antoinette's lifestyle and a lot of these rumors circulated around her ultimately, while they by no means caused the revolution, it made her a target when the revolution erupted in 1789. And by October 5th, Parisians had marched from Paris to Versailles, murdering a number of people on their way, as you can see in the print on the left, and they forced Marie Antoinette and her family to come back to Paris. And as a result, in late 1789, when she was taken from Versailles to the Tuileries Palace in Paris, seen on the right, Marie Antoinette was the last person to ever live at the Château de Versailles. So as an epilogue, I want to talk a bit about what happened to chateaus after the French Revolution. So as I'm sure many of you know, Marie Antoinette was ultimately guillotined in 1793, much of which on behalf of part of a trial that comprised of a lot of lies, of things that really were manufactured to make her a symbol. And you can see on the right is an illustration done of her on her way to the guillotine. After her execution, most of the French aristocracy either was murdered, as you can see from the guillotine, or from this image, the fate of Princesse de Lamballe, who was literally torn apart in the streets. Those who were not killed became the émigrés, who left France and went to other places in Europe, such as Madame Royale, who is Marie Antoinette's daughter. And so their properties were seized, and many of them were destroyed, as you can see in this painting by Hubert Robert. Because aristocracy and nobility, the whole system was abolished by the French Revolution, the whole symbolic role of chateaux ceased to exist. So while buildings similar to chateaux were still built, the whole culture of chateaux and what makes a chateau, based on what I hope I illustrate in this presentation, really ceased to exist after the French Revolution. Now, the monarchy had been restored, and there were other noble systems in the 19th century, such as that of Napoleon and Napoleon III, but they didn't really live in these chateaux in the same way. They were mostly used for ceremonial purposes. And you can see on the left is a painting showing Napoleon III receiving the Siamese embassy in the Salle de Bal in Fontainebleau, the same Salle de Bal that had been commissioned by Henri II for his mistress Diane de Poitiers in the 16th century. really, the legacy of the chateau in many ways comes to the United States, where rich families like the Vanderbilts and the Morgans, through the wealth that they acquired during the Gilded Age, they used the chateau and its symbolic power as a way to express their new position in society. And on the left is an image of Marble House in Newport, Rhode Island, a very large mansion that was modeled off of the Petit Trianon that had been built for Madame de Pompadour and expanded by Marie Antoinette. Today, of course, chateaus are extremely important ways to learn about the history of France, but they're also very important to the French economy. Versailles is one of the most visited tourist sites in the world, attracting 7.5 million visitors in 2017 alone. And all other chateaus, including Chambord, are also incredibly popular tourist destinations because they're living places of history that allow us to learn about people like the 5 women we discussed today through living history. Now, chateaus are often seen as old vestiges of a rich, privileged society that we're glad to be without. But as you've seen today, many of these stories tied to these women were in fact very tragic. Eleanor of Aquitaine's relationship with the Château de Chinon was that she was imprisoned there by her own husband for several months. Joan of Arc's experience in a chateau was that she was kept in the Château de Rouen, where she was ultimately tortured and burned alive. Diane de Poitiers' beloved Château de Chenonceau was discarded from her after the death of Henry II when she was sent into exile, and it was used as a political tool by her rival, Catherine de' Medici. And for the Marquise de Montespan, Versailles was the chateau that she used to rule over until she was exiled in disgrace, and all traces of her were removed by her successors. And then finally, Marie Antoinette, the beautiful Chateau of the Petit Trianon, which for her was her only refuge, ultimately became the symbol of her prestige that was used against her. But while these are all very tragic stories, they really highlight why chateaus are very important and very complex places where we can live and explore the history of France in general, but these 5 amazing women in particular. Thank you so much for attending.